everyone, and good whatever wonderful moment of this day you are enjoying on your time zones, whether it's good morning or good afternoon or good night. It's always such a joy knowing that you take the time and the curiosity to join us. My name is Minola Jacques. I will be your co-host for the next hour or so. As usual, we have Jessa working her magic backstage, and we have an amazing lineup of speakers today, the day 7 of our November series. And today we will be talking in this panel about labor laws and continuous compliance. Now, while our speakers will come on stage, I will welcome everybody in the audience. Please do drop us in the comments just a short note. Let us know where you're watching or listening from. It's nice to travel with Hacking HR panels literally around the world. And also, just a kind reminder, consider this conversation as much yours as it is our panelists. So do drop your thoughts, your stories, your experiences with labor laws and compliance in the chat. And also, do drop whatever resources you have been using and finding particularly helpful and meaningful. Those resources really help community to grow and learn. Now, let's make the most out of a short hour today. You are all Hacking HR friends and panel veterans. So what I will do, I will start us off with just passing the e-mic around clockwise as you appear on my screen, and I hope that Jess can join us shortly. The first one is always easy. Please shortly introduce yourselves and what exactly made compliance and labor law so meaningful to you that you decided, I'm going to take time and speak about it and make it friendly to other people. Matt, it's good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you. Mel, how are you?
Well, dealing with weather and November, and it's crazy that it's Christmas in a few weeks.
And evidently a water mishap based on the group chat offline. So hope that you're doing okay with the consumption of water. I'm Matt Burns. I'm a former HR executive, consultant, and now a value advisor. I've been in the industry for about 20 years. What most people don't know about my background, though, is that I spent the first 8 to 10 of it in employee relations and labor law. So this topic for me is particularly passionate, though I don't speak about it very often publicly. And why I'm excited about it is I think we're entering into a new era of compliance where there's 2 things happening at the same time. There's the introduction of AI and technology, which is going to surface information and insights and cause some really interesting disruptions around, do we really need to be technical experts in HR, or do we just need to have really good tools to support smart people? And then the second question is around the changing demographics in the world and how governments are reacting to the fact that employees are working in multiple jurisdictions, if they're gig-based or freelancers, for example. So I think there's a lot of things happening in this space that make it a really interesting topic, and I'm excited to hear the panelists' perspective on it.
Thank you so very much. Rita, good to see you. Good to have you with us on this one.
Good morning from Los Angeles. Thank you for having me. I also have HR executive background for close to 20 years. What not many know about my background is that I started working with refugees and immigrants as a caseworker and intake counselor and social worker. And that was the reason years and years ago that I realized that knowing the laws, knowing the responsibilities, knowing the rights of employees, it's very, very important. People get passionate about it. So it's always our responsibility as management and human resources to stay updated with the compliance, but also to be aware of what's out there, what's impacting, what's evolving and changing in a workforce and in a society that is impacting our labor laws. So this way we can create a cohesive environment. We could not only stay in compliance, but make sure we have a safe and healthy environment and positive environment. I'm very passionate about compliance. I also been a 6 years of contract compliance auditor in the past. So it's an area that I find it very interesting. It's more of like a detective work, but at the same time, how we can translate it, that we could customize it to each and every employee in the workplace that is relatable. That's why I'm here.
Thank you, Rita. Charmaine, Welcome. It's good to see you, and it's good to have you in this conversation.
Likewise, good to see everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Charmaine. I am also an HR executive. Been doing this for almost 2 decades and started my own consultancy, which really focuses on organizational and talent development recently. Why this topic is really important to me. So in my first life, I wanted to be an attorney and specifically employment law. And throughout my HR career, compliance was always something that was really huge, especially when we talked about or thought about employment law. And I've always worked for global companies. So then that was also another factor and level that we had to look at things through. And a lot of things that, the other panelists mentioned too, Matt talked about AI. My first 2 degrees are in information systems, computer stuff. So I am all over AI. I love it. And I really, really see the need for compliance even more so, especially when we think about what does AI mean and how is that impacting every facet of the world, therefore the workforce.
This is absolutely wonderful, and I see Jessa working with Jess backstage to fix the tech problem. So we will go agile, not fragile, and we will welcome her back whenever she can join. Now, before the questions will come in the comments, yes, this conversation is being recorded, so don't worry. You can always go back and listen to it or recommend it to friends and colleagues. Now, I was wondering what makes compliance so meaningful. You all hinted at some new trends emerging, at some new things coming from the future of work and all the changes, both within the workplaces and overall around the world. So what makes compliance meaningful now for companies? And I will use this question as training for unmuting. So let's see who goes first.
I can go first.
Please.
Compliance, what is the definition of compliance, right? What's our understanding of compliance? Often it could mean something different to human resources and then the employees and then to the manager and the frontline employees. What compliance means is understanding what's acceptable, what's meaningful, and what's a must and regulatory for the workforce. So that's my understanding of compliance. So I think we have to take the time to understand what does it mean. Does it translate to state labor laws? Does it translate to federal labor laws? Are we talking about employers' policies? Are we talking about procedures and best practices? So we have to have an understanding of what compliance means in each areas. Then we can break it down and explain it better.
I would absolutely echo the same thing. It always starts, and I love that you brought it up, Rita. It is really important to have a baseline understanding, right? A lot of times we throw around terminology. We don't ensure that there's a common understanding of what that means. So I love that you pointed that out. And, I think compliance means a lot of things for a lot of different people, right? But when you come down to it, I think it has a lot to do with conformity, right? And establishing what we're all going to be conforming to. And obviously that's going to be driven by laws and, it's also about risk mitigation, having a framework of ethical standards that everyone knows, okay, here are the parameters that we are to operate within, and understanding what a refusal to operate within that is going to lead to, right? So what does accountability look like? I also think it has a lot to do with your organizational reputation, right? And everyone's going to have shareholders or investors. So that reputation piece is also going to be really important. And then trust, right? We're talking about the workforce, can an employee trust that what you are doing is upholding the ethical standards that you have stated, right? That you're expecting to hold them to. And all of this ecosystem is why it's important in my mind.
At the risk of repeating what Rita and Charmaine have already said, which great answers, I think to me it's a state of established norms in an organization. And there, of course, are external norms and internal norms that, broadly speaking, there's alignment around. There will always be people who have differences of opinions, whether it's law or policy or practice. But we've decided as an organization, this is the set of parameters that we're going to operate within. One thing I've been thinking about more lately, though, is when I first started my career 20 years ago, there was an understanding that once you established a rule, that was kind of the way things were. You kind of put that to bed and moved on to other problems. Increasingly, we're being asked to go back and revisit areas of compliance on a more frequent basis and evaluate whether they make sense. And I think about diversity and inclusion in particular. Some of the policies that we put in place are very exclusionary. They don't factor in the groups that may require access to certain resources or certain benefits or certain information. Because we're so focused on risk and compliance, we don't often look at the lens that happens outside of that. So I think compliance to me is that set of established norms, but it needs to evolve into an ongoing conversation about, does this make sense? And then if it makes sense, let's talk about compliance and accountability.
I loved all these nuances that you brought into the conversation, and that triggered a question in my mind. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. How can compliance be a statement to the organizational culture? How much of it is, simple discipline, and how much of it is accountability for doing the right things the right way? Matt, I see you nodding, so that caught my attention.
I think it depends on the context. So I've worked in industries where health and safety is primary. In transportation, where there's a very real risk to employee health and safety, passenger health and safety. So therefore, we're very, very, compliance is the top of the pyramid, as it were. In those organizations, compliance becomes a much deeper bond than just simply what goes on a piece of paper. There's a trust that has to be extended back and forth, but there's always a tension between employee safety, organizational performance, profitability. You'll see that with airlines. You see that in lots of organizations. But in other contexts, compliance might be different in a technology company that's producing, for example, social media platform, where there may not be as an immediate or apparent risk to somebody's health and safety, but that does have compliance elements around privacy or around the sharing of information. So I think understanding the context, Manola, is really, really important as you establish kind of what the rules of the road are. And then it's have an understanding of what your stakeholders value in the context of compliance so that you can build a strategy that makes sense in that. You don't want to bring over a compliance view for example, the energy sector and bring it over to retail. It's not going to be a good proxy, but you can take lessons from one and inform the other.
Absolutely. I would agree to that. And, Matt brought up a really good point in terms of the industry that you're in, and anything to do with patient care is going to likely have very high, standards and rigorous processes that must be followed. I've definitely worked in organizations that were not saving lives, but they decided at different times, well, we're not going to comply with this thing, right? So yes, there's laws, there's regulations, but when we talk about the company culture and whether or not that's going to be something that the culture wants to adhere to, right? So I've definitely worked for places and spoken to leaders who said, well, for example, in the US now that a few states have adopted, the mandatory salary requirements, there are companies that I know of who've said, we're just not going to do it, right? We'll take the fine, right? Which brings another side of compliance is that sometimes that accountability piece isn't strong enough to really incentivize people to actually follow through on it, right? So I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, because I will tell you that from my experience, a lot of the times when it comes to violating government, whether city, state, federal, it's not that big of a risk if a company's doing extremely well, right? The monetary thing is a slap on the wrist. So a lot of times they may say, well, we'll just take this. So I also think the other side of it has to be, and you mentioned this in terms of responsibility, is what does accountability look like? So I do think that if we want more compliance in certain areas or better adherence to the compliance, then the accountability measures have to really measure up. So for me, that's government has to stop saying it's a $250 fine for a first violation, or, it has to be something that feels painful for someone to really comply. So whether or not that is in relation to laws or anything else, right? If how I'm going to be held accountable isn't something that really matters to me, I'm probably not going to follow through if I don't want to, right? That's human nature.
To add to great points that Matt and Charmaine brought, company culture and industry makes a huge difference. as well as the state we're operating. I have been experienced in my share of private, government, and nonprofit world, and different sizes of organizations, and the workforce, the number of the employees, the state, the industry makes a huge difference. What's the norm in each industry, and what's the norm in each state, as well as what do we have to do? Are we going to take that fine? Are we going to make sure that we are, number one, employers that everybody wants to work with us and come and start their employment with us? It makes a huge difference. Culture matters very, very much. HR is just a piece in communication. There's this example that I have that has recently happened. I transitioned from healthcare to entertainment, and I noticed a huge difference in a cultural shift from a private to a nonprofit. It's a huge difference that the way the board of directors are, the way that the managements are. It doesn't say one is better than the other or supersedes, but there are certain compliance and labor laws that I notice it relates differently and translates differently, and government looks at it differently when it comes to private versus nonprofit versus this state, that state. And prior to that, it was a multi-state organization. So for me, it was very fascinating to see how labor law, and how, pregnancy, for example, or FMLA and disabilities translated in this state, California, versus somewhere else like Florida. So for me, it's always like, okay, as an employer and company, should we come up with something that is universal? Should we come up with something that is a company policy that supersedes all that? And we are, going with the policy that it will allow all employees to be treated fairly and equally. So those are the areas that also needs a lot of attention, in my opinion, and that comes down from board of directors and executives. And HR is just we're part of that puzzle to make sure that we'll get there, and hopefully we'll get there. That's my goal.
I also want to be mindful of people in audience, from different countries, from different legal and business language environments, that when we use acronyms, we also refer to what they stand for. So Rita, you mentioned FMLA. So I looked it up. That stands for Family and Medical Leave Act, if I'm not mistaken. So just a friendly call out when we use acronyms that might be very everyday language to us, we also put the meaning behind them. When it comes to continuous compliance to, let me read the title, to evolving labor laws, who does what? Who has accountability and responsibility for what? And Charmaine, I loved your point there that, some decisions are being made almost outside of HR. So an underlying sub-question, is the accountability and responsibility strictly boxed in the HR function, or how is that happening across organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it depends on the organization, right? It depends on that organizational culture, and culture is always going to be shaped by the context of which you live. So the region of the world that you live in, what isn't acceptable. There's all these different layers to it. I do think, there's a difference between accountability and responsibility. I think that HR is responsible for helping to ensure that the organization is, aware of what is changing and how that's going to impact the way that it works, and providing that advice. I always say, look, as HR, my job as a risk mitigator and advisor, I cannot force you to follow, the suggestions that I'm making. But ultimately, I think the accountability is going to come down on the leadership, right? Like outside of HR, are you willing to move forward with this, right? I can certainly think of maybe too many examples, right, of advising leaders about the risk of not complying with whether it was internal policy or federal in the U.S. or policy in another country or region that we were operating in, and them still making the decision that they were willing to take the risk, right? So I really think that it's our responsibility, if we're HR practitioners, to help advise and provide the lay of the land. Like, here's what could happen, here's our risk of exposure. But I think ultimately the responsibility is going to come down to whether or not the other people, because HR is not making that decision independently, are going to adhere to it. One thing that I always say is HR, I am big on put it in writing, right? So when I outline this, I have so many times I've said, and if someone else is making the decision, just going on record to say this is what my advice is. Understand that you want to do some, you want to go a different direction, that type of thing. Because for me, when the crap hits the fan, and I think a lot of times when we've been in HR for a while, we can predict the future in some areas, right? So I would say 95% of the time when what was predicted happened, I'm like, okay, what's my plan? How are we going to navigate this, right? But at least I know that I did my part.
Rita, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'll go next. Great point Charmaine made there. That is really, really great point. Because ultimately, often there are decisions that is, I hate to use this word, but I'm going to use it, above our pay grade. I have to pull ranks here. So in the end of the day, if it's not our organization, we have, everybody has a boss and we have a board of directors, and it is our job to advise. And I love the fact that, Charmaine, you mentioned that, yes, we have to say, this is what I advise, this is what my view is, this is what I foresee. But in the end of the day, if it's not decided, oh, well, it's not our decision. However, we warned the management, we brought it up, and it is, in the end of the day, their decision, which route they're going to take. Although I have to add something that it makes a huge difference, in my opinion, how much transitional and transactional HR is versus a strategic business partnering organization. So the company culture makes a huge difference. So ultimately, yes, accountability is top executive decisions. HR is responsible to mediate. HR is responsible to bring up those points and the warnings, and hopefully creating a collaborative, relationship.
Yeah, I fully agree with the points that have been said. Maybe want to take it a bit of a different direction in light of our most recent question, which is, I've always struggled personally with those scenarios whereby my leadership team does not want to be compliant. So as Charmaine's telling the story around that, well, maybe we just won't follow that law or just miss that. That to me, I had like a visceral reaction inside of myself, because I'm a very compliant driven person, because I understand that that's the price of admission around trust. That the moment you stop following those rules, you're sending an implicit signal, if not explicit signal, to your employees that you can pick and choose what you actually want to do and what you don't want to do. And if I'm an employee, I don't have a lot of confidence that they're not going to do the same thing and try and apply the same standard in another situation that might actually affect me more personally. So I think that's a really risky approach to take. And I understand that there may be some valid reasons why an organization might take issue with a certain law or legislation or regulation, but there are vehicles to go through that process that don't involve non-compliance. So I'll just own it. I've never been very good when my CEO or board said, we're going to do this, and I said, that is not legal, and they said, we're going to do it anyway. I never was going to be the person that said, okay. I was going to come back with case law, with legal opinion, with emails, with conversations. I wasn't always successful, as Charmaine pointed out, in getting what I was looking for. But I was clear in providing information such that the stakeholder could make the right decision. But what was interesting for me was, and I don't think folks who are outside of HR often have a full appreciation of how often an HR executive's values are challenged on a daily basis because of the information that we're privy to inside of an organization. We're privy to all the best and all the not so good. And if you have a CEO or an executive that has questionable ethics or integrity, especially around compliance, you will see that in HR, and you will often be forced to make a decision on how do you react to that. You can do nothing, or you can intervene, and intervening also comes with its own risks around stakeholder management and career moves and things like that. So it's a complicated situation, Manola, which is why the HR team is perfectly positioned to do it, because we understand the nature of human interaction better than most of our counterparts. But ultimately, it's the accountability of senior leadership, CEO, and board. Rita's put it earlier, it's why they're paid the big bucks. It's part of that accountability, part of that reward comes with that accountability. HR needs support, but HR can't take the mantle of accountability from the groups that really need to own it.
I was thinking, taking into consideration differences across industry regulations, country-specific labor laws, organizational decisions overall, I was wondering, what would you put on a compliance checklist. If you could draw up your dream compliance checklist, what would go onto it?
Mine would be a very simple RASI chart. Like it would just be very clear around accountability, responsibility based on our previous conversation. Compliance is hard enough, but when we're not clear about who owns what or who's responsible for what, we make it 10 times more difficult. So I think a very simple RASI chart. The other thing I'd like to see in Manola is a wide swath of people involved in the accountability conversation. I think oftentimes organizations can default to centralizing that accountability, that responsibility to certain groups: HR, payroll, health and safety, compliance, audit. And then they, as a consequence, in some cases, may actually divest other people in the organization who may abdicate their authority to others who are responsible for this. I don't have to worry about this. I think in that case, I'd want to see a checklist that has broad representation from across the organization, so people understood that it's important to the key members and the key decision makers in our team.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I personally always start with understanding where we are, right? So that would be the first step. You know, what are the compliance laws, regulations where we are located, whether that's the region, wherever we are in the world, that we need to adhere to if we're running an organization, right? As it comes to, you know, shareholders, employees, et cetera. And then doing an assessment to figure out where are we as an organization, right? First step for me is what is it that we need to comply to? Then what do we have in place, right? And lining up that. And then, you know, as Matt mentioned, there's the chart, and, you know, for anyone on the call, there's also a responsibility assignment matrix, and the R is responsible, A is accountable, consulted is C, and I is informed. And it really just speaks about who's going to be doing what, right? Who's going to be responsible. But for me, it always starts with understanding what do we have to comply to, and then doing an internal assessment. Where are we? What do we have in place? And, you know, even if I think about this from a change management perspective, trying to understand and working to understand what the barriers for change might be if change is needed and identified, right? Because no matter what we do, no matter who gets assigned responsibility, if we don't understand if there is resistance to change, why that might be, and work for that, it's still not going to move forward. I have certainly been places where you could assign things to the ends of the earth, right? But assigning it doesn't mean that we're going to move forward. So I really think it's, what do we have to comply to? Where are we? Do we have challenges with change? Or maybe people are open to change, but then what's that process going to look like? Because sometimes people are just afraid to take that first step.
Great points said earlier. Just to give an example is that for me, compliance, as all of us, you know, it starts from the posting a position, you know, selection process, interviewing, training, hiring, onboarding, and all of that, right? Training, employee relations, and so forth. But as an example is what's happening and what's important at the given time. I had challenged management that we don't have enough diversity in the past. You know, with employers. And I said, we need to hire certain groups. We need to hire certain this. And the question was like, well, we don't have enough resumes. I don't know. So I said, okay, that's my mission. Challenge accepted. So compliance for me and my team and recruitment team was to hire certain groups and certain to improve diversity. So I think that communication needs to happen between HR and management, because who's responsible and who's accountable, often it's a very, very fine line. Are we making the selection? Are we doing the initial interviews, for example, or the managers? So it just comes down to simple examples of what's happening on a daily basis and how that translates to our day-to-day operation of the departments. And it starts there, in my opinion.
Manola, may I add something to what Rita shared? So Rita, I think what you brought up was a really good point in terms of needing to, you know, shore up some areas when an organization has it. The piece I would want to offer is, you know, where my rebellious spirit has come to light is that when an organization has said, or we've identified there's these groups missing, if I know that those groups coming into the organization will damage those people, personally, I don't care what the quota is that the organization is trying to fill, because the environment isn't one where they will survive and thrive. And I think that's another thing that we have to be mindful of, because for me, my personal ethics of compliance means I'm not going to send the lamb into the slaughter, right? And and I've left organizations when it has not been aligned, right? So I just want to make that clear to everyone. But I do think too, compliance has to be, whether or not we as HR, and I do think we have a part of our role is accountability, are holding leaders accountable when they're not following through, right? I remember working at one place where the leader was very clear of not only the height, hair color, and body type of people he wanted working for him, which is wild in many cases, but that was something where I'm like, absolutely not. Will I follow through on that? I can't force other people, to not do that if they are concerned about not fulfilling that. But I think if we know that something is not going to be beneficial to other people, our internal compliance bells need to go off, because we know that we could be harming other people, right? So if an organization is not willing to show that people who might be at the center of harm, that they are not above the company, then I personally think part of HR's own internal compliance is to ensure that we do not subject people to harm when we are aware that harm could exist.
So we entered the second half of our conversation. Just a quick welcome to everybody who joined us over the past minutes. And I'm wondering, for those who have this feeling that compliance is daunting and very technical and overwhelming and maybe not so glamorous as other bits of work in HR, what skills and what capabilities would you recommend them to look into to make this territory a little bit more easy to grasp and more effectively navigated? And I'm interested, can you think of some skills that are not necessarily the first ones that people would assume that enable compliance work? Anything that comes to mind?
I can go first. Maybe this will start a conversation. I think management style matters. Each department, we do have culture in an organization, but I highly believe that we have mini cultures. So it's a layer of cultures. You'll see different management style in different departments within the same organization, and they have a different way of doing things, and the norm, it seems, is a little bit different. Of course, it has to be aligned with the overall culture, right? It has to be aligned with the overall policies and procedures and what's the norm for that organization. But I think empowering the managers to have their own way of doing things while they're in compliance, it's a really empowering thing. It's a really good thing. So that, encouraging those management styles, encouraging those engagements with employees, it makes a huge difference. I think keeping engagement in mind and customizing each compliance, how that translates and means, and the meaning of it to each department and to the culture of each department and the workforce, it makes a huge difference. Managers, sometimes they can offer to put a pretty bow on delivering a big change, right? That is coming, knowing their direct line of employees, right? So I think it's very important to look into the management style and what works, and make it more of a best practice. And so others can relate to it, and maybe that will help other departments to improve their management styles. I've noticed that too. There's a huge gap between one management style than the other management styles, and often employees, they communicate to one another if the same compliance and same policies applies to each one of them differently or the same way, and how is that communicated to them? So they translate it. They say, what does it mean to me, right? Why my manager said it this way, and then why I'm not doing it this way. So I think management skills and style, and also engagement that they have in place, it should be taken into consideration.
I love this question, Manola. And the first three things that popped into my mind were interpersonal skills, adaptability, and storytelling. And for me, I'm anchoring on storytelling because if you can't tell the story for why we are going this direction. If you can't get people to be hooked, like it's a series, right, you're not going to be able to move forward. So I really think the storytelling aspect, and I do think, that's an area where, and I love HR, but I think that's an area where HR does have an opportunity to, level up, so to speak. What's that story we're telling? How are we connecting with our audience, right? Whether that's a stakeholder, whether it's the employee, because people will get on board with something that they feel connected to. And if we're able to understand and answer the with them, right? What's in it for me, for every single person, or for the majority of the people, I do believe that we would do a lot better with adoption. I think a lot of times where I've seen resistance, it has been because, like quite frankly, all of this legal jargon and these, if you just read one of them, just read one law, right? I don't care what country you're in, just read the language, your eyes can roll over, right? Your ears can start to just, be terrified of hearing anything else, right? Because the big thing is that it's so much legalese that a lot of times people are just, they're glassing over with it. So I do think the ability to tell a story in a captivating way that, helps hopefully inspire that change would be great. And that's why I think adaptability is important, right? Because we have to be willing to adapt the way that we've done things and then lean into those interpersonal skills to make the connection. So those are my 3.
I'm so glad that nobody talked about technical skills, because I was going to rally against technical skills. I say that because, as I mentioned earlier, 20 years ago when I started in HR, if you knew the labor law in your local jurisdiction, that was seen as a positive thing. In fact, they would question you about it. They'd quiz you on it. And as I mentioned, I was in employee relations, so I did a lot of collective bargaining, arbitrations, where knowing case law and knowing specific information was really, really critical. We're entering into an era now, though, where information has been so democratized, and AI is going to only supercharge that, where you don't no longer need to be a deep technical expert, but do you have the ability to synthesize large sums of information, because there's so much of it. What do you look at? And then curation is really important, to Charmaine's point, how to put things in the right sequence so that people can understand and connect with them. And then storytelling really does blend all those things together to bring it to life. I think HR has to make that shift. And we've traditionally been cast in the role of being a compliance arm in organizations because other people saw fit to do that, whether it was in payroll or whether it was employment legislation. That being what it is, we're getting to an era now where that information is so much more available and free and easy to access, and that compliance will soon become automated in a lot of cases, that it really does come down to change management and stakeholder relations. So I think the group said it really, really well. That's the area where I'd spend my time. Don't spend your time digging deep into legislation for countries. Don't spend your time digging into labor law, but rather look at the tools available to you that can provide that information, can synthesize it for you, and build your leadership skills so that you can lean on a broader group of people to provide that support.
I'd love to take this conversation a little bit deeper, but with a different spin to it. I've been asking this same question every panel I get over the past weeks. For people in the audience who live and work in the reality of an HR function of one, and they have to do compliance in addition and on top and under everything else, what would be your advice for them to best purpose their focus and energy when dealing with continuous compliance?
I keep really good resources available that are self-service for my clients wherever possible. If I could pair it with a chatbot or AI to make their searching easier and less complicated and therefore reduce the volume of questions my way, that's where I would probably go. The vast majority of human capital management transactions are transactional. Somebody gets hired, somebody gets paid, somebody changes addresses or changes their marital status. They change locations, they change jobs, they change their hours of work. A lot of it's very, very transactional. As a consequence, most of those activities can be automated and can be user-driven, if not have HR be the approver in some cases for things like pay increases or discipline, for example. But you can create a mechanism whereby it's self-service, it's decentralized, and doesn't require the individuals in the company to come directly to HR in a physical sense to get service. So I think by thinking about HR of team of one, I think about the resources and the tools that I can provide to my team but then I want to spend as much of my valuable time as possible interacting with my colleagues and with my peers and with my leaders, and as little time as possible doing administration, which is really, really hard if you don't have the right tool sets, and really, really hard if you don't have the right resource guide. So I would start there, Manola, and I would build towards that plan.
Yeah, I love the use of AI that you mentioned, Matt. I think that's great. And as someone who loves it, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. I also think that a lot of times when people are in positions of being the only, we get in our heads and think I have to do everything. And, that's the resources piece, right? So what is available to you that might be free, right? There are organizations that offer free support services, right? Is that something that you can partner with, right? If you are in the US, is there city, state, federal level support that you could be able to get? Some of these resources are sometimes free or low cost. Sometimes, law firms, for example, maybe have someone help you audit, right? Might be low cost or free, dependent. And I think if in any other region of the world, right, there's some type of resource, at least for an aspect of all the gajillion things on your plate, that could either help you automate or could serve as the resource to get that done, right? So I think, yes, it's hard when you are a person of one, even if you're on a team and unfortunately you have teammates who don't really pull their weight. It can feel like you're in a team of one, right? So tap into the resources that are available that might be free. I don't want to plug anyone, but there's lots of HR organizations out there. Sometimes memberships are free or low cost. Look into those, right? What are the supports and those resources, right? A lot of them have templates already made. If you're using AI, it could be requesting AI to help you create a template, right? And you're just plugging and playing. One thing I did at an organization was create an internal learning and development database, essentially, and it just had different sections. So people just knew, oh, I want to understand what a job description for this looks like. Let me go here, right? So it might take some upfront work, but I think other than automating, it's looking to see what free or low cost resources are available to you in the region that you're in. Because like I said, a lot of city, state, if in the US, or local government, might offer, no matter where you are, may offer some type of support or at least advisement around some issues that you're having.
I don't have much to add, and great points were mentioned. AI technologies, subscribe to a variety of different sites, HR organizations. There are a lot of resources out there that is free, it's low cost, and you could start networking in LinkedIn with your counterpartners and professionals, and ask for advice or ask for how do you do this in your organization? How should I apply to this? Give me an advice. So connecting and networking, it's a free resource that we all have. And I utilize it all the time myself personally, including, signing up with those resources that you mentioned, Charmaine and Matt. Great points.
Well, in full honesty, I was sitting here and I was trying to imagine all the learnings and unlearnings and conversations and war stories that generated all this experience that you're sharing today. And if there are other people just as curious as I am now, is there a particular story that you can share that really gave you extraordinarily meaningful takeaways when doing this kind of work? Anything that comes to mind? A moment of triumph, a moment of learning.
There's something I want to share. Not many people know about this. My husband and I stayed in a refugee camp for 2 years. At the time, I was helping a lot of refugees in that facility and translating for United Nations, voluntarily helping them, trying to help them to fill out their paperwork and what this means to them. What are the resources? And I was the point person that I held their documents and immigration paperwork for that 40 plus, immigrants and refugees, and we all came to New York. And still I get goosebumps. That was over close to 3 decades ago. And I knew that I love math, I love algebra, but I knew at the time that I love humans and I love to be a resource. And how can I translate what I know and how can I transfer that and make it simpler? So for me to helping someone to find out what the resources are available, and that was the reason I became an intake counselor in the Catholic Charities of Los Angeles, to make sure that what this law means to me, how can I find them a job? How can I help them to remove their barriers? What they could do to make sure that they know their rights and responsibilities and how to be an advocate for themselves. So for me to be an advocate and making sure that I'm there protecting their legal documents all the way to New York, looking back, I still get goosebumps and feel empowered by it, because the trust that they had in me, holding on to their documents that they could get into country legally. So that was something that it triggered me, that I really want to work with people. And I happened to get into human resources, and I noticed that it's an area that I could probably add value, and I've been here for close to 2 decades. I love it. It's a passion of mine, and hopefully that I will learn more and contribute more to the industry and the profession itself.
Thank you, Rita.
Been racking my brain trying to figure out, but Rita, your story inspired me. So I think for me, when I think about the compliance pieces that I'm most proud of, it's more around helping people understand what their rights are, right? And helping them understand what compliance could mean for them, right? So whether or not that is helping them connect the dots for, their rights for employment law, whether that's helping them understand their rights because of what the established policies within the organization are. For me, that's throughout my career, and even now, that's when I become most proud, because you can see the light bulb in the person's eyes, go off. You can see that there might be a sense of relief, even if they may not like the path that they have to take. Just that awareness, right? That knowledge piece is really critical. So anytime that I've been fortunate enough to help someone using the skills that I've acquired, and as you said, Manola, so many war stories, I am most proud, because it's tangibly making a difference in someone's life and empowering them to make the choices that they need to make for themselves next, right? So that's my story.
I wish I could end things on a more positive note, but I think the most impactful for me actually came from a pretty sad and dark place. Early in my career, I was tasked with supporting an exit conversation. There was an individual who needed to leave the organization for a number of reasons. There was a series of integrity violations. There had been a lengthy investigation, and it culminated in a conversation between their supervisor, myself as the HR person, and them as we asked them eventually to move on and leave the organization. As a consequence of that message, the person ultimately had a medical emergency in the room while we had the conversation, which was obviously something that for me early in my HR career, I really wasn't prepared for and didn't anticipate. It was already challenging and awkward enough to be in a conversation where someone was losing their job, but then to have on top of that a medical emergency. Fortunately, everything turned out well. We had first aid attendees on site, and nothing came of it aside from just that short-term kind of chaos. But it for me imprinted the importance of the messages that we deliver have a real effect to people. And oftentimes in HR, we get to deliver really positive messages. Congratulations, you have a new job. Congratulations, you're being promoted. And there are times we'd be part of conversations that are not as pleasant. And it, for me, provided a whole bunch of empathy such that every other activity that I was part of, whether it was one-on-one or part of a larger activity, I always ensured that we had outplacement support present, and that we had medical support either arranged, or at least we had the mechanisms and the protocols and people knew what to do in the event that we had one, so that if we had a similar situation again in the future, we wouldn't have that same outcome. And ultimately, we didn't have that, but I felt that was a really important signal to us going forward, just to show that people are humans and we want to make sure we respect and support them.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. And it's sad and it's frustrating for me to say we're about 8 minutes away from wrapping this conversation up. My next question is an open question. And whether there was something that ever since you signed up for this panel you were thinking about, and it's important for you and it's relevant for you, and you want to share with an audience. Is there something about labor law and compliance that we didn't touch throughout our conversation, but you do want to tell the audience this piece of maybe reflection or advice or information?
I would say don't be afraid of it. Oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Oh, you jumped in. Go ahead.
I would say don't be afraid of it. You know, again, I think a lot of times we have these big monsters that live in our head with things, right? We are all compliant to something in life, right? Whether there's rules at home that we have to follow. In my home, no shoes in my house, right? That's a rule that people have to follow, right? And if they want to come over, right? So I think that sometimes we look at something and it gets really overwhelming. And the reality is that we're all doing this in a different aspect of our lives. So it's just about educating yourselves around what applies to you. Don't overwhelm yourself, and operating within that framework, right? It doesn't have to be overwhelming. And just remember, you're already doing compliance in many aspects of your life, right? And you yourself has set compliance type rules, whether for yourself, you know, if you work out every day, if you don't, whatever it is that you do, you already are adhering to certain rules and regulations for yourself, within your family, within your friend groups. So it's the same principles being applied. So don't be afraid of it.
I would just add that in the rush to be compliant, let's not forget that we're dealing with people. And I always look at things like intention and malice when I assess compliance. We all make mistakes. The world is moving so fast. And I don't know about you, but I have a hard time remembering what meeting I have coming up next and what meeting I just came from, let alone detailed compliance pieces. So I think just having some empathy and some patience with folks in the organization that may struggle at times, but to have the clarity around the compliance, people understand the standard they need to work towards. So I think that two-pronged approach around compliance and coaching is a really key piece, especially today.
I have to agree with Matt on that too. Transitioning from a fast-paced healthcare large organization to smaller, entertainment organization, I learned that exercising and practicing my level of patience, me slowing it down and understanding. And it's okay that I'm not in a go because I felt there's something missing. But I realized after months and months that it was nice to pause, and I continue to do that, to pause and understand there's a human aspects into it. Yes, we want to be in compliance. The emails are going out. We're enforcing certain things, but in the end of the day, I like to reflect on what the day looked like or a month looked like. Because we are, again, dealing with humans. We are, we love AI technology, but we're not, robots ourselves. We are humans and we're dealing with humans. And that's why, it's important to find out what that means truly and how that is applied, as Charmaine said, to each and every one of, individuals in the organization, including ourselves. We often forget about ourselves. And I know I'm guilty of doing that too.
And another one last thing for me is it's okay if you're in an environment that you don't feel is aligned to you. It's okay to leave. Right? A lot of times people feel they have to try to navigate that environment and stay within it. It's okay to leave if it's not aligned. If their behaviors or activities that aren't aligned with who you are ethically, who you are morally, it's okay to say goodbye, right? We can do our part in voicing our concern, but ultimately, if you're not the person in charge of making that shift, it's okay that shift be you leaving, right? So I think that's a part of compliance that throughout my career I had to come to. I can give this advice, I can do this assessment, I can have the case studies behind me to prove like, here's what law has shown. But ultimately, if the behaviors around employment law, around compliance or anything were just not aligned to me, my choice was that I could leave. Right. And I know that's scary for a lot of people, but for me, it came down to, am I going to have to be upset with myself every time I look at myself in the mirror because I'm participating in something that doesn't feel aligned to me? Or am I going to do the hard thing and exit, right? So I just want to let everyone know that if something is not aligned to you, it's okay to exit that situation.
Thank you all so much. And we are 3 minutes away from wrapping this one up. So one final question, wanting to leave the audience on a note of support and encouragement and something to look forward to. What would you say are the biggest enablers for compliance? Or who are the biggest allies, maybe in terms of roles inside the company? And I will give you a few seconds to think about that. Just thanking everybody in the audience for being here today. And if you want to go back and just add to your notes or recommend this conversation, you can do that, and you can find the recording either on our space on LinkedIn or on hackinghrlab.io, our platform. So, enablers and allies for compliance work.
Well, allies I've touched on earlier. I think it's the executive team. You need to have those allies in order to advance anything in an organization and sustain the change. So I think that's a critical piece. And enablers are organizations and communities like this. We have an incredible community here at Hacking HR that I'm part of myself for years now, and Manola and Jessa and Charmaine and Rita, we've met many times before. I think it's the opportunity to build a community and learn and grow from each other. That's the value of communities like this and how we can really take compliance collectively to the next level.
Thank you, Matt. Rita.
I agree. Executive team, they're the best allies. But I like also to see if I could have line managers and supervisors to be an ally because they could be the ears and eyes and the messengers that they're right there, right? They know their team better than we do, in my opinion. I can't be there every second of every day, but I like to work on making them and, not making them, working on, making sure that they are my allies as well. And enablers, in my opinion, yes, great resources and communities like this, it's amazing. Great resources out there and networking communities. But what I also want to see that if there is one employee who trusts HR, there's one employee who sees the change as a positive change, there's one employee or one department, they could be an enablers, because we need someone in the organization to say, you know what, guys, I think this is a good thing. Let's talk about it. We need those voices in the organizations. I think, that we could also rely on those to be our enablers. Even one employee, I think, is good enough for each department even.
Thank you, Rita. That was awesome. Charmaine.
For me, it goes back to storytelling, because I think enablers, and allies can be the same thing too. So answering the what's in it for me for someone is really important. And then I like to call it the flash mob, right? You teach them sections and then everyone's doing the dance, right? So if you're able to take an approach where you're educating people, answering the what's in it for them, and then presented it in a way that resonates with the cultural of not only the organization, but the regional context that you're in, I think you get to create your flash mob, and you can have a flash mob full of enablers and allies.
Rita, Charmaine, and Matt, it's been an absolute joy. And who would have thought I would get one of the highlights of my week from a compliance conversation? Thank you. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for being here. I do recommend that you stay on the link, because we have an amazing conversation on workforce and VUCA. Right after this one, we have an awesome lineup of speakers, and you will enjoy a great Hacking HR fellow moderator. Thank you, everyone, and I will get to see you in conversations next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and good whatever wonderful moment of the day you're enjoying on your time zones. I wasn't scheduled to facilitate this session, so if you just rolled from the previous conversation, I was in no way, shape, or form tooting my own horn when I announced an amazing moderator. But here I am. Sometimes life happens more intensely than anticipated. So my name is Minola Jacques, and I will continue to be your co-host for the second conversation today. Jessa is still backstage. And also backstage, we have an amazing lineup of speakers because the topic is absolutely timely. We will be discussing about preparing the workforce to navigate the VUCA realities of our business landscape. So, Jessa, please do help me bring up the speakers on stage. How wonderful to see all your faces. And while you get used to seeing yourselves on the screen and you try to guess how will we go about with moving the eMic around the screen, I will continue to welcome the audience. And please do help us with dropping short comments. At least do let us know where we travel around the world with this conversation. And that helps us twofold. First, we make sure that technology still works and we're not trapped in some LinkedIn Live loophole somewhere in the space of internet. And second, we are so interested to really hear your VUCA stories from the workplace. We can only imagine how many different experiences and different nuances you can bring into this conversation. So without further ado, let's make the most out of our hour today. I am so excited. I got one extra surprise hour gift with Hacking HR, and we will make it easy at first. I will pass the eMic around as you appear on my screen clockwise. That means, Becky, you will be our pioneer for today. So a short introduction. And what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear VUCA? That stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So Becky, welcome. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm losing my voice a little bit. I'm not sick, but so I hope you guys can hear me okay. I am joining you from the Twin Cities metro area in Minnesota, so northern U.S., and it's a pleasure to be here. I would say to answer your question kicking at, the first thing I think of is communication and how key it is to navigate everything pertaining to VUCA. I think, and it's underestimated how important it is.
Thank you so very much. Frank, it's been a short minute since we last shared the screen.
Good to see you, my friend, and thank you, everyone. Happy day. Hope everyone is safe and well. Frank, pronouns are he, him, his. I think the thing that first comes to mind is almost a phrase. It's the consistency in change is what comes to my mind.
That's wonderful. And probably with the reality that we are all navigating in some way, shape, or form, it's also intensity on top of that consistency. Carol, good to see you.
Good morning. Carol Cooley coming to you from Denver, Colorado. Pronouns are she, her, hers. Frank stole a little bit of my thunder. Change was definitely something that came to mind for me, but I'll also add information and disinformation. So those three things really buckle together, I think, when we were talking about volatility and uncertainty and some of the conditions that create that environment.
Well, just want to clarify that thunder is a rare commodity on Hacking HR panel, so I hope you all trained your unmuting reflexes. Taylor, good to see you. How are you?
Living the dream as always. Thanks for staying on and moderating this panel and having us all here. My name's Taylor Bradley. I'm the head of HR Business Partners and Compensation with Turing, based in Washington, D.C. And when I think of VUCA, maybe not getting that pronunciation correctly, but it takes me back to my days as a firefighter paramedic. You don't get to choose what emergencies and things you respond to, but it is your problem to solve. So I'm really excited to talk about that opportunity that's before us today.
Thank you so very much. And last but not least, Sarah, so good to see you back in our conversation.
Hi, it's so nice to see you too. I have no idea how I'm going to beat what Taylor said or add something new to the conversation. But I'll say, I typically, when I'm on these panels, I'll represent kind of the combination of HR and communications, which really that communication and information piece really is shining through here. I'm going to add the pressure that comes along with these situations in all of the different ways.
How wonderful. And I was just thinking as I was listening to all of you that actually me being here is an expression of VUCA. Now, truth be told, I wasn't necessarily very much looking forward to a walk in gloomy, rainy, wet Basel, but this is so much better. Also proof that good things can come out of VUCA. Now, before we move straight into being hyper positive about VUCA, I would really love to hear your thoughts about how do you see VUCA affecting organizations nowadays. I would imagine that, we're still reeling from COVID. As I look around the world, so many sad, expressions and realities of VUCA pop up. So how does a VUCA outside environment bleed into organizations, and what are some of the immediate effects? And I don't know why, for some reason, I always go diagonally first. So Carol, please take this one away.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm in the banking industry. And so VUCA has been kind of squarely in our mindset for the better part of this year. I think it's thinking about those external environment influences that can kind of come out of nowhere. If I think back to the beginning of this year, a lot of folks were talking about the decline in the layoffs in the technology sector. Then come February and March, it swung around and really hit Silicon Valley Bank heavily. And being in the regional banking industry, it really, it was something that we needed to address as a bank right away. And it's not something that we had anticipated. So when I think of VUCA, that's a very real example of, the quick swings in terms of industry, the reactions, I talked earlier about the availability of information and the way that social media helps perpetrate that and create sometimes a bigger reaction than might have been present, even just a couple of years ago. So swinging the pendulum really quickly, having to react as a business and having to help the people within the business be able to react in that way as well.
And now one of my favorite moments when I declare the unmuting competition officially open. So please build your conversation. Next, Becky.
All right, I'm going to go first. Just to take a little bit off of what Carol said. So I do HR in the startup scale-up tech space, and we're feeling a huge impact of the economy and the layoffs that have been occurring. And it was a huge swing from what was happening the year prior. So we went from being in a situation where let's just say from even like a talent acquisition standpoint, where it was very much an employee's market to like now, and I hate to say it, it's a little bit more of an employer's market. And, we're getting tons of job applications because the market is flooded, different positions we're looking for. Unfortunately, on the flip side, and something we're navigating, and even in my networks of other tech HR leaders, is with layoffs and things were going really, really, really well. And then all of a sudden you have to turn around and lay people off. It's very challenging. And again, it's making sure I think you manage that change management process very carefully and operate with high empathy. And the more transparent you can be with the decisions that you're making, the better. So for us, sometimes it's just like as simple as like you're trying to extend the company's runway and keep the company afloat until you can be prepared enough for your next round of fundraising. So I kind of feel like in the startup space, we always are in the VUCA environment, but it's been really challenging the last year.
You know, I'm just going to keep building on everything else that's already said. You know, I always think about the research piece again, right? I always go use research. I'm going to say research, practical, and then from the people experience. You know, from like the research piece of it, and this is public information. Project Globe, if you ever search for that, there's some results from a global standpoint, I think. And the piece that I want to pull from that, it's an ongoing research, both from profit and nonprofit. Project Globe. It's the collectiveness, the inclusive. So working in EIB for a couple of decades, I see some of the consistency in there, where organizationally the decline of encouragement, of employee encouragement, is there every time. And then I think from the group, right, just from like individual functions and teams, the decline is in connections. It's no longer important, right? So with that, you know, the kind of skip leveling and best practice of HR, right? The insights of what could we have prepared for, to Carol's point, it's like some things that we might not have been ready for. But what about the things we could have been ready for? When we're at a high, we should be looking at kind of, you know, effectiveness, and when we're at a low, a little bit more efficiency. You know there's going to be a peak and then, you know, a valleys, right? So what, you know, that becomes a disvalue right there in the middle. And then I say from the inclusion, exclusion, kind of in-group, out-group, right? Everybody said that here as our opening, kind of the communication and the crisis management. Now we're being very reactive to it. And what that does is like the information, you know, we're all about tactical, and then the information sharing just decreases too. With that, it's just, we're negatively wired. Let's just be honest. And I'll end there, right? We're negatively wired. And so the disinformation or available information, we're only going to share what's like really, you know, pertinent, what's going on. And then we fill in individually as employees with negative information, like, oh, okay, must be this, must be that. So-and-so is no longer here, to Becky's point, right? Or this is not going on. You know, what's next, right? And so I think it actually increases the VUCA, actually, right, from an employee experience.
Taylor, I saw you unmuted.
Thank you. So I'll take a more macro approach, because I think there's been so much great practical advice so far. So to add on to that, I'll paraphrase a conversation or a speech that Barack Obama just gave. And he was talking about younger generations view the current environment. And he often has heard them say, this is the worst they've ever seen, right? But being a student of history that he is that these types of volatility that we see in our time have existed since humans have been around. So I actually find comfort and optimism of the path forward that we as people leaders can offer. And I'll take us briefly to 1960. Francis Aguilar, a professor at Harvard, came up with another acronym that I'll throw at you. And I'd love to see that in the chat, which of these topics resonates most with the challenge that you're facing in your business, to all of our listeners. So the acronym is PESTLE. And initially it was PEST, but it evolved into this. And that represents these types of influences on our companies: political, economic, social, technology, environmental, and legal. Now, love to again see in the chat which of those resonate with you all, that you're feeling is providing the most influence. But the reason I find comfort and optimism in that is that these types of influences have been around at least since 1960, right? And to Frank's point, there's been a lot of research on this. But now is our generation as leaders to take the torch and move people forward into the future of work. And we have so many tools, including the introduction of new technology that has a positive influences, such as AI, to really transform the way that we're working to respond to these things. But optimism is something that I think we need to inject more into the conversation and provide some hands-on solutions that my fellow panelists have just mentioned, which I think are great insights so far.
So why am I always coming up behind Taylor here? This was poorly planned on my part. I'll act a bit like the caboose here in wrapping up a little bit of what you all said and just highlighting a few things that came to mind. One, I fully support the optimistic perspective on this. And I know, Manola, you opened us up with that to say, natural human tendency is to look at the negative. And when we think about VUCA, I think we generally think negative, but what are the silver linings? What are the optimistic outcomes that potentially could happen here? And I really appreciate that, Taylor, that you mentioned it too. As I was preparing for this conversation today, one of the things that I was thinking about was how do we tap into the collective knowledge and experience of those around us? All of us have experienced a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. We all have a lot to offer other people in terms of how to work through these types of situations and our organizations. So I think that we need to not forget about that, because I think that's another thing we tend to do, right? A new employee comes in and it's like they're fresh. There's nothing behind them, but they have a wealth of experience behind them that really comes to play here. But when we think about what the effects of some of this have been long-term that we need to really be thinking about, I often look at the micro and then, how that works from there. So I think individually, and correct me if any of you think that I'm wrong, we are exhausted, like absolutely thoroughly exhausted with the amount of change and disruption that has happened. And that impact on an organization, the burnout factor at an organizational level is so detrimental. At the same time, as all of these companies that we're working for are trying to recalibrate coming out of the pandemic and dealing with all of the economic and political factors that are going on in the world, they are trying to change to meet the future and what that holds. So it's another layer of change. And oftentimes that change that they're undertaking is not 1 or 2 change efforts. It's 50, 60, 100 lines of change management that are going on within an organization. Then you think about the macro change that's happening and the micro change that's happening in all of our lives and the tragedies and change, positive sometimes, that we're dealing with as individuals. And it is overwhelming. So the burnout and the overwhelm, layer into that the lack of trust that comes from disinformation, comes from a lack of stability because of the disconnection that was mentioned before. And we all are living in a world of VUCA all the time already. So just to kind of like loop it up, like we all know how to survive. We're all doing it every day, but we can do a better job of helping each other and organizationally, like helping the people that work within our businesses. So that was a lot. Pass it back to you, Manola.
Thank you so much. And I will pay attention, Sarah, to make sure that you don't come right after Taylor next. So it's funny that you all mentioned that a few days, which could feel like a few years ago already. So a few days ago, I was running a change management workshop, and we were talking about VUCA and its implications. And I remember, people were sharing their stories, and I think visually. And for some reason, at one point, I had this image in my head of like change matryoshka dolls at the rave party. Sometimes it really feels like that. Now, as we want to move forward, I was wondering, what would it mean concretely to prepare the workforce for whatever comes? And I'm thinking there are some industry related nuances. There are organization type or activity nuances. I would expect even sheer geographical nuances on how we prepare the workforce. But I was wondering, Becky, if you have some insights to share with us on this one.
Yeah. What couple of things that come to mind, and kind of when you're talking about preparing the future workforce and what has worked well, I guess, in the startup scale up side of things for us, is just anything that we're first and foremost, I think it's kind of promoting a culture of resilience. And by that, I think it's just keeping an eye on things like stress management, and uncertainty and challenges and things around that. So I think if you have that in your culture, and acknowledge that there could be pivots and bumps in the roads and quick changes. From there, I would say the two things that really work well, or at least in my experience, is that anything you're building, whether it's you're working on a project or a process or a program or a big initiative, kind of build it with that agile mindset, so that it can be flexible and responsive to anything that you might encounter in the future, and nimble. And I think that's just the way the world that I'm in works. But I feel like that strategy would apply in many other different industries, when facing, volatile, VUCA type situations and environments. Another thing too, that I would just throw out that I think is super critical in this aspect too, is having, I would say, empowerment too with your people. So giving your employees and your leaders the autonomy to make decisions within their area that work best for their areas. So we always talk about, and I'm probably getting way too much more on the HR culture side, but like we talk about your massive company culture that you're building. I'm a firm believer in letting there be a lot of different subcultures. Those teams know what works best. They know how to navigate challenges and change quickly. They know how each other works. So instead of kind of creating a one prescription for all, allow those teams to operate that way. And I think they'll be able to react to change individually as teams versus company-wide, if that makes sense.
Sarah, would you like to go next?
Oh, thank you. I'll keep it short, because I think that it all falls within that communication space for me, and the openness and the willingness as leaders, which is sometimes difficult, to say, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. And when something happens, I don't necessarily know the best way through it, but I'm here with you. And I trust that collectively we have the ability to do this. We have done hard things. We will do hard things. And we all have something to contribute here. I think there is something to that, just willingness to not have all of the answers. That means a lot. Willingness to not know all of the answers, to acknowledge that, but also to talk about all of the things openly. Because when you avoid or obfuscate or whatever, you're creating a vacuum for people to get lost and for that mistrust to continue. So I think it's a combination of, being aware of what you know and what you don't know, being willing to say that, and then keeping the dialogue going all of the time. And it is uncomfortable. I think that's something as HR leaders that we need to do for our counterparts in the organization, is help them through that, help them with that. Because they need that partner to say, it's okay. I've got you. You're doing it. You don't know. Sometimes I don't know. It's all right.
Carol.
Yeah, I think Sarah really hit on kind of a deeper level of what I'm thinking. And it all goes down to, for me, a foundation of trust. And Becky hinted at it as well. It's being able to engage individual employees on a level of where they're coming from, being able to meet them where they're at. And I think, even more when you think about the world of work being much more interconnected to the broader global world than ever before. And you throw people into the mix as well, and they bring their own home lives. And it's become increasingly harder to separate, this is who I am and what I do at work, and this is who I am and what I do at home. And I think, as building a foundation of trust, I think one of the things that we may be able to do as HR practitioners is really help our managers, to Sarah's point, say, I don't know. I don't have all the answers, as a way to build foundational trust in the organization. Because ultimately, to me, to move past this, you really need to be able to listen to what is important to the individual employee. And without building that trust and understanding that they're bringing their full selves to work and reacting differently, you're not going to be able to get them to be able to share with you what's most important and then be able to address that. So again, I think foundations are trust and the ability to engage the employee in a very strong listening strategy.
I just want to tap onto that. I know I'm going out of turn, and I think it just builds with the, the trust thing is like the best leaders that I have seen navigate through really challenging times are the ones who will show their vulnerability, to what Sarah was kind of hinting at by saying, I don't know the answers, but I'm here for you. We're in this together. That vulnerability piece, when demonstrated even at the top, is key. And I think it kind of unlocks a door for everyone else to be like, okay, and to be their true selves and maybe talk about their vulnerabilities or things that are on their mind or they're challenged and things maybe they're suffering with at home. So just wanted to throw that word in there.
So now the competition for the hot seat is between Taylor and Frank.
Taylor, go last this time. I love it. It's all good. I'll just solidify, I think, everything that has been said already. I think evidence-wise, right? So there's two things that come to mind, authenticity. When we're talking about that transparency, and often I keep hearing this over and over about authenticity, like, bringing your authentic self. But from a leadership standpoint, right, at your most senior leaders, a lot of what we're looking for is also the tribulation part of it. The everything's not so grand. I do want to hear a little bit of the negative so that I can fill in my mind with the optimism or the resilience piece, or how I can contribute, because as humans we want to contribute. And often as leaders we miss the mark sometimes. We're like, hey, everything's grand, and we're always looking at the positive, and our profit's still doing great. This is when yeah, we lost a few folks, but we're still doing this, and yeah, we got to change direction. Say a little bit about yourself and how it's dealing with you. And evidence shows that actually builds a grander rapport / trust, that piece of authenticity, the what's not so great, and do it small, intimate, in listening sessions, like it's been said. If you want to be bold, you can kind of button it up a little bit, but at a town hall and a grander audience, that resonates with folks, right? And I would say the other piece is this resistance to scale, resistance to change scale. That there's an instrument out there that's actually been around for 20 years, fairly easy one. And it kind of measures our routine. We're routine seekers. We are very rigid in our experiences. We don't like change. We're also very short-term focused. We look at things in quarter and week by week, day by day, that kind of thing. And the last thing is that, we're a little bit emotional, right? So that's okay. And so when you look at that, I think that's a really good scale to look at your organization and say, what combats that resistance or that negativity? It's connection, evidence-based wise. So this is just all saying, everything that's been said, it's backed up by research, and it hasn't changed. To Taylor's point, this has been around, right? It's not new. Don't treat it like it's new. So, how do we do? What's the new craze on how we deal with this? Simple. Connections. And let's not always talk about the positivity when I just know my friend got laid off, or a function had to change, or I got put in a position that I don't know, or I'm now managing double the amount of folks because we did a shift in our organization, right? Just talk a little bit about I don't want to say negative, maybe somebody else can help me out with a different word, but just keeping it real.com is what I'll say. I digress.
Frank, I would say recognizing the reality, right? Being anchored in that is important. And this week, I was fortunate enough to attend as a guest CNBC's Workforce Executive Council, and there were two buzzwords that were flying around, and it's as if Becky was there as well, because one of them was flexibility and the importance of that. So I'll touch on the other briefly, was innovation. And in our training opportunities for the business, we need to, yes, help them with the change management of the moment, but also what change do we need to do to be sustainable and scale into the future. And I used to say, think just Blockbuster and Redbox, but now it's think Blockbuster, Redbox, and then Netflix, right? And so this is a journey that you have immense power to influence in your organization as people leaders to help define what does the next forward-looking decade look like for your organization. And a second part to innovation that's exceptionally important that Frank touched on, and just the data is there on this, is connecting the daily work that everyone's doing to the innovation that they're ideally driving. And in R&D functions, I see this the most common is emerging level talent, your new software engineers. They may not understand how the code they're writing or adjusting on a daily basis is influencing or fitting into the architect's view of where the organization is going. And so there needs to be intentionality of connecting the work that people are doing, exactly, Frank, the work that people are doing to the overall mission of the organization. The data, the research is there. This is not a new problem, but it is something that we struggle with still as people leaders. So I'd really encourage everyone to think of everything the panelists said, and then also what innovation can you help connect and drive in your organization?
You know, Taylor, that actually was making me think about one of the realities that we live in with all of this is our gut instinct and reaction to deal with the thing at hand. And so our short-term thinking, and then our ability to kind of pivot and look long-term too. And there's, I wrote it down, like something really beautiful about what you said of the motivating factor behind, you know, well, what's after Netflix? Like, let's like be part of that. Like what you're doing today will be part of that. And there is something about that that kind of flips the way that you think about everything that's going on and allows you to really pivot your own self and work through something in a way that you might not think that you could have. And I mean that individually and organizationally. I have one other thing that I just wanted to add that Frank reminded me of. And I really hope that organizations do this. And if they don't, maybe they will going forward. Brene Brown has this thing that she talks about that she does with her family. It's a personal thing between her and her spouse where she'll, you know, they come home from work and they'll say like, how much energy do you have to deal with what's going on here? You know, and if she's like, I've got 20%, I got 20% of my tank right now, you know, and her spouse will say, all right, well, I can carry your part because I'm at 100. So we're good. If we could do that organizationally, I think dealing with these things would be so much easier. That acknowledgement of like, how much do you got in your tank? We go, I've got this. I can work through this because it's different all the time. And sometimes it might not be the leader that is at the 80, 100%. It might be other people in the business who can step up and help others rally and work through difficult situations. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Thank you. I found it sweetly funny how your reflex of going right after Taylor kicked in, Sarah. That was wonderful. Now we are a few minutes already in the second part of our conversation. It's absolutely amazing how time flies. And I was sitting here listening to everything that you just shared, and this question kept popping up in my mind. Who does what when it comes to preparing the workforce? And the secret agenda question there is how much is it within HR in terms of accountability and responsibility, and how much is it outside of HR in terms of accountability and responsibility? And Frank, I see you nodding energetically, so please take it away.
Oh gosh, you're okay. Is it because my eyes went like this? I'm just agreeing, like I'm nodding, like yes, like I'm taking notes over here too. I'm a participant. I forgot I'm a panelist. It's definitely, I think that was a rhetorical question. It's definitely not HR's job to do that. It could be the catalog, house of, where the development is and actually be obviously housing, HRS systems and other things, right? Obviously the development of things that are actually documented, but it's absolutely going to be on any coach, anybody who has a direct report. It is absolutely not only their accountability, but their ownership on that. But I think there's some things, as we talk about VUCA and things just personality wise, there's some worry there. So as all these environmental things that are going on, which is about 40% influencing your personality of 60%, as your worry increases, your opportunity to be open to experiences, to put things in order, processes, in order to make those connections, in order to deal with the conflict, decreases over and over and over. And that's actually been around. Also, Taylor's going to love this, since the 60s as well. Heavily researched, not just stateside. This is an international phenomenon, right? So how do you decrease that for coaches so that they take that ownership? Is you have to build the capability of how do they deal with their own worry, and maybe even to Taylor's point, like what's next, right? Like what's next, and that kind of a SICAP is what we call it, right? How do you build other people's? How does this coach build other people's, efficacy, right? Their hope or pathway, their optimism, positivity, right? Or even resilience in spite of you're going to go through hardships. Work is not in general a fun place, but can we be purposeful with that, right? And so they absolutely have to own all that. Again, can we be the catalog house of, what are some offerings, right? We always have that available. Absolutely. But it's got to be every single coach takes that. We build their capability with that so that they can have ownership and accountability. Anybody who's a coach, I think, at any level, because you are absolutely projecting any of your, perfectionism, your worry, all this kind of stuff. People see that you're a little bit awkward. There's a lot of video clips out there. Just search for them, right? Of even your most senior leader of like having hiccups where they're trying to I'm trying to spin this in a really great way. And it's like, okay, build their capability so that they could deal with that and own this piece of it. It cannot be HR for sure.
Carol.
Yeah, I agree, Frank. This is not necessarily, at its core an HR problem to solve. But I think there's certain things that HR can do to help enable, to your point, the success of individuals that we place in that role. I also think there's a leadership component that we haven't talked about yet. So the leadership of the organization, I think, needs to affirmatively decide and articulate that this is a role we want our managers to play. And in some organizations that might not be as clearly articulated as in others. So I think, that could be a shared responsibility between leadership and HR, is to really articulate that, potentially embed it into your performance management process, into your leadership profiles, into the capabilities and competencies that you want your leaders to have in the organization. But I think it really goes back to, again, articulating what those expectations are for your leaders. Then Frank already mentioned, upskilling, those that are really uncomfortable with that part of the role of being a manager. So HR can take a really strong and intentional hand in helping shape the capability and the competency of leaders who find themselves in that role. Last but not least, I think HR has a role to play once we have collected the information from our employees. There are things, programs, different strategies that we could put in place potentially to help bolster how employees are feeling, whether that is, mental health resources or flexible time off opportunities. There are programmatic things that you can do, again, not as the end all be all of this is going to solve the problem, but again, to Becky's point earlier, the more flexibility that you can provide to individuals to be able to deal with what they're facing on a day-to-day basis and rely on each other and rely on programs to help support them when they need it most. Those are the things that I think HR can really do to contribute and raise to the organization that, things are very different. Even though we've had some of the similar issues since the 60s or before, we're facing different times where people are coming forward and asking for mental health resource, that they're asking for more flexibility in scheduling or time off. And I think we can listen as HR professionals and reflect that back through the programs that we offer within the organization.
That was so beautifully said, Carol. I can't add a whole lot to it, but it did make me think of a few things. I'm in agreement. I would be surprised if Becky or Taylor did not agree with this, but maybe if you do, that will cause for a lively conversation. But this is clearly not an HR only responsibility. However, don't sit back and wait. This is you as HR professionals, we do have a lot of the skills and abilities to be able to help our leaders, our managers, our employees through a lot of this and help build that capacity and capability. So if you're not seeing it happen, if the conversations are not happening, bring it up, be the advocate and show some of the pathway to how to get there and make really clear that this is a shared responsibility up, down, diagonally throughout the organization. I also wanted to mention, I'll just put a plug in here for the thing I think is most important. And Frank made me think about it because I did notice, Frank, that you referred to managers as coaches. And that's right. That is right. It's a mindset shift, right? When you hear coach and you hear manager, you think something different about what the responsibilities are of those roles. And to be a coach, you need a coach. So I think that's something businesses over the last several years have worked hard to integrate coaching into their business beyond executives and problem issues. However, everyone needs someone to help be a thought partner with them and to help ask the provocative questions that challenge the way that you're thinking. And coaching is such a beautiful way to do that. And it's not a hard thing to do. There's so many options now for businesses that didn't exist so long ago. So that's I would say, if you put it at the top of your list in terms of how to deal with VUCA, like make sure you've got support system in there. Give your coaches coaches.
Just two quick comments I'll add. Sarah, I loved your point. I think the HR professionals really proved during the pandemic that we are fully capable of handling these types of situations and hard environments and hard challenges. And really a silver lining, I think, that came out of the pandemic is that I truly feel we earned our seat at the table, and that that we're looked at as experts in that area, even if we might not have all the answers. And one thing, and I think Frank was kind of alluding to this too, but I would say is one role I think we play in this that's critical is to bring the voice of the employees up to the leadership team or to the leaders or to managers and be that kind of liaison between that. I mean, as much as you want to say you have coaches and a transparent culture, there's still going to be employees. I see it a lot of time with my engineers that aren't comfortable doing that, or in a global situation, there's just different cultures that don't speak up and are a little bit more, quiet or passive aggressive. And so it's HR's, I think, role to build that trust in those relationships. So whether you're doing, state interviews or constant surveying, I think, everyone talks about data and metrics, but there's so much behind the qualitative data that you're going to get versus the quantitative. And all of that is, I think, your most powerful weapon to bring up to help your leaders navigate and make decisions during these times. So
I'll happy to jump in, but in the spirit of sounding like I'm from DC, I want to yield a portion of my time to Frank. You mentioned in the private channel about stay surveys. I think you should do a quick plug on that. You're on mute, Frank.
That's a technique to re-engage us in the conversation.
I got you. I see what you're doing there, Taylor. I love it. No, I love it. No, I mentioned keeping it practical. Best practice, of course, that HR can own is a state survey. Right? We often talk about that as best practice in HR, but let's ask ourselves, how often do we actually do that? And do they trust us if we were to do that? And just keeping it really simple, that voice of the employee, as Becky was mentioning, right? I think it's huge. And I've done intervention kind of calls like that, where just touching base, how are things going, this and that. But you can aggregate the themes from some of that qualitative data that was mentioned. So I think just stay survey, can't mention that enough. Thank you, Taylor. Back to you at the studio.
I'll reclaim my time, right? No, the final thing I would add is your voice and how you present yourself to your team is something well within your control. And some of the most difficult conversations I've ever had as a business partner is anchoring to reality to a manager that may be running around with their hair on fire. And I always say, I don't have a lot left, so I can't do that. It's important to demonstrate professionalism and set the tone for your team, because the way that you respond to situations is amplified and imitated by the people that are on your team. And so if you do run around panicked, worried about everything, and having that just exude into your team, they will eventually fail, because people, we're human, can only compensate in that type of environment for so long. So it's okay to acknowledge that there's really difficult things that you have to do or tackle in the future. Very important to keep that in mind. But you can present that to your team in a professional way, as opposed to panicking or externally worrying all the time.
I hope my memory is not misfiring, but I think it's in Scaling Leadership. This wonderful quote that good leaders are thermometers and great leaders are thermostats. And that stayed with me, and then I do use it quite a lot. Now, I am still under the inspiring influence of a recent podcast with Naveen Jain. And he said something. He said that the question you ask drives and defines the problem you solve. So I was wondering, do you have any particularly meaningful, powerful questions that you ask in the conversations you are having within the workplace now? Do you have like a particular signature question? Is there something that you stole with pride from someone else? So particularly powerful, unlocking questions that you use in your conversations. I will give you a few seconds to think about. And in the meantime, because I just realized I didn't mention, or I did and I forgot, so I'm sorry. You can find the recording of this conversation either on our LinkedIn space or on hackinghrlab.io platform. And with this, I've done my advertising duty with some delay, but we live in a VUCA world. So powerful questions. Let's see.
I'll go
Sarah.
first. I'll go first. That way I don't have to be worried about huffing somebody else's great response. But this is one that I use all the time, because I use this question to check my own self, because I oftentimes will take the evidence that, and I think many of us do this. I take the evidence that's around me and I have an assumption about what is going on. And I'm also a big caretaker and I want to help people with their problems. But if I am assuming a problem that does not exist, then I am failing before I even start. So I oftentimes will ask, what would be most helpful right now?
I feel like we're already training for the mic drop round. That's good. Who goes next?
I think something for me is so I set the stage of how can I improve, and I'll pause, especially for my introverts. I'll pause for like 10 seconds, which can seem like an eternity. And if they still don't say something, I'll mention something that I think I fouled up on, and keep it tangible, and that creates this environment of trust of like, well, what you could do, right? Like, I'm opening myself up, and then we kind of explore other things. But again, just how can I improve?
Carol.
I think about in my role working with leaders and as an HR business partner at heart, oftentimes I will ask something to the effect of, what challenges or headwinds are you seeing now that maybe you didn't see 3 or 6 months ago? And to Frank's very earlier point around trying to anticipate, where things are headed and get in front of it and not be so reactive. And I always follow that up with, and how can I best support you as you're looking at that as a primary challenge? So I also like what you posed us with at the beginning of this conversation, Manola, which is, what problem are we trying to solve? That's one I use in my toolbox all the time.
Becky, I saw you unmuted, and I see, Taylor, you're specializing in going last. So Becky and then Taylor.
I always like to ask what's keeping you up at night. And I do it kind of a couple of reasons. Sometimes you can get a personal response. Sometimes I'll gear it towards work-wise, but we've all been there where, you're done with your work for the day, but you're still stewing on, or there's a problem or a challenge that you're thinking about at night. So I always like to ask that. And sometimes people get kind of like, it's got to only be a severe issue or concern, but it's been a good question in my experience.
Becky, to answer your question, a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old is what keeps me up at night. But
I got a 3-year-old. I'm right there with you, Taylor.
You know it, right? So for me, I'll give more of a statement that really caught me. I know we all listen to podcasts quite often, and there was just one statement that the podcast host said that really got to me the other day. And it's CJ Gustafson. I may be getting that name incorrect. He'll forgive me. Yeah, but run the numbers. And it's predominantly for CFOs. But he asked this question or posed this statement of, don't be the CFO of no, be the CFO of why. And I reframed that into HR for me of, there's many times that we do have to say no. We have to be a guardrail. But if you reframe that as a why, I think it really helps us bridge the gap and better communicate with our leaders. And then to give the part B, always ask, what does the data say? It's always a good place to start.
Any last questions that popped in your mind as you were listening to your fellow speakers sharing theirs?
I don't know who had said, what's the problem we're trying to solve? But another complimentary question I'll ask is, what's our end goal here? What's our end state? Or next state, future state? There is no end, by the way, but it just helps people think a little bit differently.
I recently heard in a conversation that we have the opportunity, or VUCA usually on the positive side creates the opportunity to move from know-it-all to learn-it-all. And I'm going to ask you a question with a bit of a different spin to it. As you have been navigating through VUCA in your own journeys, whether personal or professional, what is the biggest unlearning that you went through? What is the biggest thing that you had to let go of that you would have taken it to the bank before? Frank, I hope you count the 10 seconds of silence after the question. Let's see who wants to tackle this one.
I'll go out there first, and I think some of this would be personal aspect is that I'll focus on failure in my career, or what I perceived as failure. There were many times when I would apply for a role at a company that I was just so excited for, only to get either ghosted or a rejection letter. And I used to take that so personally of, what is it about me? I didn't do something right. But that would always inevitably lead to the next awesome step in my career. And so I really had to unlearn personalizing rejection in life. That is a part of life. And using that to empower and finding really what the next step is supposed to be in your career. So that was something that through trial and tribulation, I had to go through and eventually let go of.
I'll go next. I think for me, as I've gone through my career, and I still have a long ways to go. I'm on the front nine still, I'll say. But for me, I think when you start out and you really look up to your senior leaders, and then you kind of become, a part of the team with them. And you're going to have moments in your career and in your work situations where people let you down. And to not personalize it, and to try to find learning lessons from it. And with that too, like, I think building a network of people that you can trust and really are looking out for your best intention is so impactful as you grow throughout your career as well. But it's just like, people I think doctors are superhumans. I grew up in a medical family, but they make mistakes too, and to realize that. So nobody's perfect.
That's a great segue for what I was going to say, Becky. So thank you for that. I think for me, it's the recovering perfectionist in me, where I think oftentimes as HR professionals, you want to go out with a really polished and kind of finished product. And, I think the environment is changing so quickly. I think COVID taught us all that a level of flexibility is really needed in an organization to be able to meet the business where it needs to go and the people where they're coming from. And so for me, part of that was, okay, well, if I've got a wheelbarrow, is that good enough? Or do I really need the Cadillac Escalade? So it's really thinking about, okay, how can we get something out that's really timely and going to help the organization versus waiting for it to be perfect.
As Brené Brown says, I'm a recovering perfectionist and an aspiring good enoughist. Yeah.
Sarah, I don't want you to go last, Sarah, so I'll wait.
Oh man! All right, I'll take it. I have two, and they're a mix of both professional and personal, because there's really not a big difference between how you show up one place and the other. It's all same shades. One is accepting that you may have done everything right, but the outcome is still not what you wanted it to be. We have to accept that that's the way it's going to be sometimes. And that's a personal lesson that I've seen bear out at work and in life. The other is a reminder that as quickly as things went wrong is as quickly as they could turn around, or something great could happen. So that's one that I really like to hold close in tough times, because you never know. Things happen fast.
Yeah, I think because there's been a lot of unlearnings, and I'm still unlearning. Ask my spouse; she will tell you that I got always a lot of unlearning. So that's almost an unfair question, but for sure, it's not the frequency of reaction. Protecting your yes, creating a little bit of sense of allure for yourself in your career, but it also allows you to step back just a little bit and listen. Not everybody's going to respond to your credentials, credibility. Not everybody's going to respond to the logic in your pitch. Not everybody's going to respond to the passion that you have. At the end of the day, just sometimes leaders just want to know, like, so what's the ask? What are the actions? And I had to really unlearn a lot of that, and kind of, what is the business phrase? I'll kind of tap on what Taylor said about the chief financial officer. Maybe you do need to be a little bit chief financial officer for yourself and say, bottom line up front, like, what's your ask? Because a lot of the leaders, not just because of the time and stuff, but they're most of them, hopefully, if you're in a good culture, have gotten past the why. They just, what's the ask? What do you want me to? What do I need to do to further this? And so as you're unlearning that piece, like, right, just forget about some of the things that you've been taught, and just kind of like, I'm asking this, and I need you to do this, and keep it short, right?
I just feel so happy and grateful that VUCA prompted me being here for this conversation, and to be able to enjoy it from a front row seat. And because I feel like this is my last question. I promise I will go out for a walk. But I want to ask all of you, and I will pass the mic around in the interest of time. In one word, after our conversation here today, how do you feel? And what we will do, we will start with Sarah. So Sarah, how do you feel after our conversation?
Optimistic.
Thank you. Taylor?
Optimistic as well.
Wonderful. Carol?
Energized.
Thank you. Frank?
Resilient.
Thank you. And Becky?
Heart-warmed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Becky, Frank, Carol, Taylor, Sarah. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for being here either now live or later with the recording. Just a thank you for taking care of us. And again, wholehearted gratitude for making my improv facilitation so enjoyable. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the day and the week. Thank you.